Kia ora tātou, welcome councillors and the media and public and staff to this meeting of the Dunedin City Council. Our opening prayer today is by the Reverend Hughson, who is the University Chaplain. Welcome, Greg, and thank you.
I'd like to thank the Mayor and Council for all you're doing to prepare for the arrival of Syrian refugees. It's an area that I'm involved with. Today I'm going to base my prayer on one of your agenda items. It's item 17 and attachment A, DCC Strategic Framework Accountabilities. So when you get to this item on the agenda, remember the prayer. Let's pray. We pray, loving God, for the City Council as they work for accountabilities from those companies that are accountable to them. Bless, we pray, all the council-controlled trading organisations that report to council, and we pray that they will indeed help people feel connected and involved in community and city affairs, that we will work together to build better communities, both at local level and communities of interest, promoting good health, ensuring people feel safe and are safe, promoting good work-life balance and full employment. We pray that people in Dunedin will live in warm and healthy homes and affordable housing options will be available to all. We pray for those who are coming to our city, for growing migrant numbers, especially refugees. We pray that Dunedin will indeed limit its impact on and adapt to environmental changes, including climate change. We pray that Dunedin will reduce reliance on non-renewable resources, minimise waste and use water responsibly. Help us to work together to build unity and community pride by celebrating the city's character, diversity and individuality through arts and culture. Help us to enable self-expression and sharing the ideas, to connect diverse people, to capitalise on the economic growth of the arts and culture sector, to utilise existing networks and foster new connections to facilitate creativity. Help us, loving God, to work together to create healthy and safe environments, quality air and water, a connected community, recreation, leisure and learning opportunities, healthcare, resilient ecosystems in communities, actively responding to climate change, reducing dependence on non-renewable resources, protecting significant landscapes, quality architecture, memorable and engaging public art, celebrating tangata whenua and European heritage, and actively reusing built heritage. Bless, we pray, all the council-controlled trading organisations as they work towards implementation of these accountabilities, and bless and guide all councillors of the DCC as they seek to ensure these strategies and prayers are implemented. Amen. And with your permission, I'll circulate this to all the church leaders for their prayers. I think it's a very helpful prayer document, so thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we'll move on to apologies. We have two apologies from Councillor Wiley and from Councillor Thompson, and an apology from Councillor Calvert for early departure. Secondly, Councillor Staines. I move that they be accepted. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against? Carried. Now on to confirmation of the agenda, and I'm going to move that the agenda be confirmed with the exception that item 27 be brought into the public part of the meeting. Seconded, Councillor Hawkins. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye.
Councillor, a question?
Sure.
I understand from staff that there's a mayoral introduction to item 27 which has been withheld by ELT. And I'm wondering, A, why it was withheld and where it is now.
The mayoral introduction is not yet complete. It is not confirmed, and in any case, it is my introduction and doesn't need to come before council for ticking off anyway. So that's why it's not here.
The staff member told me of this introduction by way of explaining that in the introduction you had covered some consultation issues which I believe should have been in item 27 itself, and that therefore I could be rest assured that this would be forthcoming today, and even though late we would know how those items were covered.
Well, I can just repeat that the introduction is not yet complete. I haven't finished it, and the staff member was mistaken in thinking that it needed to come here.
Thank you.
So I'll put it, all those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against? Carried. On to item 3, declaration of interest. That's for noting. Prime Minister, please.
Your Worship, just for clarification, does that mean that item 26 will be dealt with in non-private and non-public, and then 27, or would we change the order?
Just bring item 27 into the end of the public part of the
Sorry,
agenda.
I just wanted to, whether that had to be part of that motion. Apologies.
Right, thank you. If they go together, they're both.
Well, it probably needs a motion that number 27 become 24, sorry.
That's fine.
Yeah. Kevin moves.
You'll move that?
Yes,
I'll
sir.
second it. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Against? Okay. Right, item 4. I'll move from the chair that the minutes of the meeting of the Dunedin City Council held on the 30th of November and 14th of December 2015 be confirmed as a correct record, including the non-public part of the minutes. Seconded Councillor Staines. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against? Carried. I'll further move that the minutes of the meeting of the Dunedin City Council held on 14th of December 2015 be confirmed as a correct record, including items 18 to 24 of the non-public part of the minutes, and that was subject of a correction, as I recall from Pam. So it is including items 18 to 24 of the non-public part of the minutes. Seconded Councillor Staines. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against? Carried. And I'll further move that the minutes of the meeting of the Dunedin City Council held on the 25th, 26th and 28th of January 2016 be confirmed as a correct record, including the non-public part of the minutes. Seconded Councillor Staines. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against? Carried. Okay, we're on to the minutes of committees. Item 5, the Hearings Committee. Councillor McTavish. Oh, sorry. I think you were the chair.
Thank you. I'll move, Your Worship.
Doesn't matter.
I'm so used to Councillor No doing them. I'll move, Your Worship, that the minutes of the Hearings Committee meeting held on 23rd and 28th of October be noted and confirmed.
Seconded Councillor Wilson. Any discussion? I'll put it. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against? Carried. Item B, the Hearings Committee. Councillor Wilson, I think.
I'll move, Your Worship, that the minutes of the Hearings Committee meeting held on the 5th of November and 10th of December be noted and confirmed.
Seconded Councillor Vandervis. Any discussion? I'll put it. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against? Carried. Item 5C, Councillor Noon.
Your Worship, I was going to seek your approval just to move on mass, and that's why I jumped up so quickly at the start. But you obviously think it's right. But I'd like to move the Hearings Committee minutes 5C, D, and E, which is C is 64 McMeekin Road, D is 47 and 49 Darzeal Road, and E is 155 Chain Hills Road.
Excellent. Thank you. Seconded Councillor Lord. Any discussion? I'll put it. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Sorry, I didn't pick up on your efficiency, Councillor Moon. Right, on to item 6, Economic Development Committee, Councillor Staines.
Thank you, Your Worship. I move that the minutes of the Economic Development Committee meeting held on the 15th of February 2016 be noted and confirmed.
Seconded Councillor Bazette. I'll put it. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against? Carried. Item 7, Finance Committee. Councillor Carroll.
I move that the minutes of the Finance Committee held on the 15th of February 2016 be noted and confirmed.
Seconded Councillor Hall. Any discussion? I'll put it. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against? Item 8, Audit and Risk Subcommittee. Councillor Calvert.
I move items 1 and 2 on 8 of our agenda.
Seconded Councillor Staines. No discussion. I'll put it. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against? Carried. On to the minutes of the community boards, and I think you're going to do the same thing again, eh?
Thank you, Worship. I'll seek your leave once again, though, that I move 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, the community board minutes for noting.
Seconded Councillor Wilson. Excellent. Any discussion? I'll put it all those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Against? Carried. Okay, on to the reports. The first one is item 15, Dunedin City Holdings Limited financials for the 6 months ended 31st of December. Welcome, Mr. Mackenzie. Mr. Crombie. Would you like to preface questions with
Good afternoon, councillors. I guess in presenting the six-month accounts for the group and the City Holdings, I'd just like a couple of quiet conversations, if I can, a couple of points. Overall, we're very pleased with the results for the first 6 months across the group from all our entities. From there, like-for-like companies, which means without Dunedin Venues Management Limited and Dunedin Venues who've now come into the group this period, but if you compare the other ones, we're ahead for the same period last year by a couple of $1 million. All our entities are performing as anticipated, which is very pleasing, so we're not seeing any specific ones up or down causing us major issues, and at this stage we have no reason to believe we won't be able to deliver on the 12-month performance to June 16. So overall, the messages are, from our perspective, a very good performance for the 6 months.
Mr. Mackenzie, would you like to... Questions, councillors? Councillor Calvert.
I've got some questions about Delta, which I've forwarded in advance, and I understand Mr. Mackenzie might be prepared to answer.
Could I suggest that we actually do that? This item's for DCHL only, and you've got the subsidiary reports as item number 16 on the agenda.
It's fine.
Councillor McTavish.
Thank you, Your Worship, and thank you, Mr. Crombie, for, I think, a positive result. I guess my question relates to DVL and DVML coming in under the group, and just wonder if you have any comment on how that transition is going, and whether you foresee any challenges with it, or whether you're quite comfortable with where things are at. Clearly, the results show that we've got a good transition going on, but just wondered if you have any sort of more operational comments, I guess.
I think Council should be aware that this is a technical transaction from one to the owner, so the technical ownership shifting from Council to the holding company. Council had delegated to the holding company the governance agency for the last couple of years, so our relationship with those boards and those companies has been reasonably consistent coming through, and I would have to say that the two companies have contributed really well over that process, so the transition has gone very well.
Councillor Vanders.
In today's media release and just now, you've suggested that it's all very pleasing and that we have a surplus of 8.7 million. Where is the noble potential loss we've just been told about in the newspaper? Where does that figure, the 13.3 million, where does that figure in these accounts? Can you point me to the page?
Well, I can't put you to the page because it's not recorded as a proposed loss, because as you'll be aware in the accounting, in Delta's accounts, that asset is sitting there at 13.3 million as the valuation, and that is consolidated up into the group accounts. So at this stage, the valuation and the Audit New Zealand sign-off have that value sitting there.
So you have also said that you've taken account of this probable loss in the accounts.
Yep.
And yet, when I read through, certainly the DCHL business, I find no reference to Noble, and I'm having trouble picking out the particular lines that refer to Noble in the Delta account as well.
Easy to point those to.
I'm wondering why they aren't actually highlighted for the public, so that we don't have to go through the torturous process of actually trying to find them in here, not finding them, and then having to bring them to this meeting.
So the total debt owing to Council overall, trade debtors, is on page 1511, or page 7 of their report. Note 13 talks about trade and other receivables. If you refer to note 13, it then gives you a reconciliation or talks about what's receivable and estimated impairment, where you see that 11973, which flows through from not just Delta but from other subsidiaries in their accounts. If you go to Delta's report, and I know we are now going all over the different items, you need to go to note 22 and then note 28.
On what page?
In Delta's accounts. It is, sorry.
101.
Yeah, 101 and then note 28, which is over slightly further, which is on page 108 through to the end, I think, 111. Sorry, it still goes there to 113.
On page 101.22, less estimated doubtful debts. Does that 11.7 million relate primarily to the Noble subdivision?
So that is, the vast majority of that is Noble, but there are other doubtful debts as well, as in other entities. One of the issues that we do have with the accounting treatment for the Noble bad debt is that we actually have to, per the accounting rules, ironically, gross the debt up because we're able to charge interest, and then on an annual basis then impair it back. So what happens is that we're saying, yes, we can charge the interest, but then we effectively write that interest off because we actually say the carrying value is less. And that carrying value, as you know, has been independently assessed by an external party and also reviewed by the auditors as well.
On page 15.5 of our report, reserves and retained earnings, it says the hedging reserve has moved by 0.833 million. It doesn't say whether it's moved up or down. Is it clear whether it's moved up or down? First page, 15.5. Reserves and retained earnings, it's kind of the second paragraph, third paragraph. The hedging reserve has moved by 0.833 million, with no indication of whether it's moved up or down.
Sorry, I would have to get you further information on that. I don't have it at hand, sorry.
Okay, could I ask that in future, if we get information regarding movement, that it invariably include whether that movement was an upward or a downward movement, because it does make a difference. Also, in the next line, the carbon credit reserve has changed value by 2 million. Again, it doesn't say whether it's gone up or down. Do you know whether that one's gone up or down 2 million?
It has increased.
Sorry, it what?
It has increased. If you go to page,
that's an up on the.
So if you go to page, if you go to page 1510, the statement of comprehensive income, you'll then see all of the movements in the reserves.
Okay, moving on to directors' insurance. It says that Dunedin City Holdings Limited and its subsidiary companies have arranged policies of directors' and officers' liability insurance, which, together with a deed of indemnity, ensure that the directors will not incur any monetary loss as a result of actions undertaken by them as directors, provided that they operate within the law. Is this a normal indemnity for directors of most New Zealand companies?
Yes, it is.
And the cost of this insurance to the ratepayer?
I don't have the figure off the top of my head.
Is it something you could forward to me?
Yes.
Thank you.
So is that just for Dunedin City Holdings?
No, I would like to know what the insurance cost generally is for all the indemnities that we provide to directors in general. And it would be lovely to have them itemised if you could.
Itemised in what sense?
In the sense of we know which directors have incurred what sort of liability.
No,
Or which
I
companies,
think
or
we're
which
missing the point.
companies have cost us for this indemnity?
So you want the cost per company for the liability
If
insurance?
possible, that would be great. Thank you. I do have a number of other questions, but I thought perhaps I could give someone else a go before I get back to some more.
Oh, no, you might as well, while you're on your feet, I don't want to tie you out.
All right. Okay. Dunedin Venues Management Limited, still on 15.5. An increase in events and reductions in rent were the main factors in the change in operating performance. Would it not be more accurate to say that an increase in the subsidy from ratepayers has been the main change in the improved operating performance?
No, because that impact is actually in Dunedin Venues Limited, not Dunedin Venues Management Limited.
So that's more of a lower interest issue then?
And Dunedin Venues Limited, not Dunedin Venues Management Limited.
Okay. If we go to 15.8, we have some very interesting numbers here and some very large ones. Shareholders' funds of 300 million, shareholders' advance of 112 million, shareholders' interest of 412 million, and a rate of return of only 2.9%. Could you please just explain what those figures mean and compare the 2.9% with the previous 5.8, 7.4, 12.9, etc.?
So the big change, as Graham spoke about earlier, was the fact that this year we're including Dunedin Venues Limited and Dunedin Venues Management Limited in the DCHL 6-month accounts. As you'll recall from prior years, you'll see that Dunedin Venues Limited actually makes a significant loss, and it's approximately $4 million, so therefore it has an impact on the financial results of the group overall. So your 2.9 versus your 5.8 is actually not a particularly relevant comparison because you're comparing apples and oranges. As Graham highlighted earlier, when you look at the companies on an individual basis, they're actually performing as at or better than budget for the current financial year.
They may well be performing better than budget, but if we look at the supposedly positive news, where Mr. Crombie says it's pleasing once again to be able to show improved financial results for the group, Aurora Energy is down slightly, Delta is a slight decrease, Torrey Gorge Railway, surplus for the period being down compared to the same period last year. There seems to be a lot of down here, which doesn't, in my view, reading it, justify the overall upbeat nature, especially if we consider Noble. But my particular question regarding the reduced rate of return, including DVL and DVML, is why is it that they are included in these accounts when the debenture holders have yet to confirm the inclusion of DVL and DVML and DCHL?
So, can I answer your first question about the performance of the group overall? So you've talked about a number of companies that are marginally less than or lower than last year. Yet City Forest's result is significantly ahead of last year. The airport has done significantly better than last year as well. So overall, the group has performed well.
Can you let Mr. Mackenzie answer your question?
So overall, that's had a positive impact on the result, which is why the media release has been crafted the way it is. On the fact of the transfer of the shares, we are getting debenture holder approval to do that. That does not mean the transaction will not occur, it just means that we need to go through the approval process. Unfortunately, when council approves to do something on the 26th of June, it's often quite hard to have something in place by the 1st of July, 5 days later, when actually there's a whole process that we need to work through, which has taken us, unfortunately, longer than we'd hoped, but we're nearly there.
Who are the debenture holders and why has it taken so long?
Well, there's a number of reasons. So the debenture holders are the people who we've got debt with, so we've raised debt from them. So they've borrowed money to us with Dunedin City Treasury Limited. So that's a number of people, and we need to get 70% approval from them. It's taken longer because, first of all, it's the first time that we've had to go through this process with the current staff, so there's been a learning process. Two, there's a significant number of legal documents that need to be filed to complete the process. So.
Okay. In today's media release, it says in the note that the Dunedin City Council owns DCHL, which in turn owns 7 subsidiary companies. None of those 7 lists Otago Power Limited or Lakes Contract Services Limited. Are they subsidiary companies or are they something different?
So those particular companies are subsidiaries. They are non-trading entities. They have one director, and actually I think I'm it. So they're there for name protection only.
Is that the reason that there are no financial reports associated with them?
Correct.
And, sorry, the reason for maintaining these companies precisely was?
As I said earlier, name protection.
Oh, to actually
protect the name.
Hold the name and nothing else?
Yeah.
Okay, so they actually don't do anything?
Correct.
All right. Excuse me, there's so many pages here.
Your Worship, could we be asked to refer, because there are so many pages, it would be really helpful if we want to follow the debate to know which pages the councillor is referring to when he's talking about things, if that's possible.
I have quoted specific pages when I've referred to specific pages, and otherwise I've quoted the media release that has been put out today, which you would have got in your email this morning if you saw it. I wish to, given the answers that I've had, frame some of the other questions that I have, so we have permission to do that later.
Are there any further questions? Well, Councillor, if you're going to reframe them, now's your opportunity, because I'm going to bring it to someone's going to move this. So, Councillor McTavish.
I'm sorry that the enormous amount of information that we've had and only being given the minimum 2 working days to look at hasn't allowed me to give this the time that I believe is due.
Sorry, I'd like to point out that we got a long-term invitation to a briefing on the papers that we all had an opportunity to attend, so there was an opportunity to get other data, and I think it's unfair to say that there's only 2 working days.
Well, I'm not sure that's a point of order, but...
Well, it's correctness of the statement, Your Worship.
That's fine. Point is taken. Councillor McTavish.
Withhold till debate.
Sorry?
I realise it's probably more of a debate issue, Your Worship.
Okay. So, that's questions. Would someone like to move Councillor Staines, second Councillor Noon? Discussion. Do you want to speak to it, Councillor Staines, in the first instance? Discussion. Councillor Vandervis.
As I've said just before, 2 days is simply not enough time for me to be able to digest the amount of information we've received.
Councillor, I didn't want to censure you, but you are giving a false impression here, because you've had the ability and the opportunity to access this information for more than 2 days. So I caution you not to misrepresent the situation, please.
Can you please explain to me how I could have got hold of this agenda more than 2 days ago, Your Worship?
You know very well I'm not just talking about the agenda, I'm talking about the information. Anyway, carry on.
I'm talking about the agenda. And the agenda is what we're here to discuss. And what I'm saying is that for me, as a city councillor, the minimum 2 days requirement is simply not enough to absorb this much information, especially the way it has been presented. I'm very unhappy that in reading through this and going through it, various parts of it numerous times, that the phrase noble subdivision doesn't appear anywhere. The phrase noble subdivision doesn't appear in the media release that was given today by Mr. Crombie. Neither does increased subsidies for the stadium, And to me, if we are to present a clear and honest representation of what the accounts are about, then the risks associated with Noble and the additional subsidies that the city is making should be very clearly flagged in accounting information. And for me at least, it wasn't. And I suggest that if it wasn't flagged clearly for me, that there would be other people that would have trouble as well. I am not convinced that the way things have been presented here, especially with the absorption of DVL and DVML, is appropriate, given that accounting, especially 6 monthly accounting, is supposed to give a record of what has actually happened. And if the debenture holders have yet to confirm the move of DVL and DVML into DCHL, plainly that has not yet happened. And if it hasn't yet happened, why is it that we're having it in these accounts now? I find that I would like to be able to vote for what is said here, especially when there is an upbeat overview of the accounts for the city, including a $5 million reduction in our $600 million debt, a little less than 1%, but at least it seems to be heading in the right direction. Except that this is on the basis of unknown or unrealised risks. It's on the basis that DCHL and the companies are no longer providing a dividend to the city. And it's the absence of this dividend in an environment where we have less in the way of interest costs, in an environment where we've been very lucky with reduced fuel costs, and this has obviously been the main reason why we have a positive result for city forests. Their fuel costs and transportation costs have lowered. So in the absence really of any, if you like, positive movement of any of the companies, and with these attendant risks, I believe that the media release that has gone out today gives an excessively rosy picture. And I also believe that the paperwork that we have in front of us remains too convoluted for the average person to be able to really make sense of. What I would very much like, and I'd hope that today's media statement from Mr. Crombie, today's media statement would have done that. What I would hope for in future is that we get a factual, accurate summary of what has actually taken place with the companies, along with a highlighting of what the expected downsides are of certain investments, for instance, like the Noble subdivision. Thank you.
Are there any further speakers? Councillor McTavish.
I just wonder, Your Worship, given the comment that has just been made, whether or not we could have confirmation from Mr. Crombie that based on this 6-month result, we are still expecting as a council to receive the budgeted dividend from DCHL as budgeted and anticipated in our long-term plan.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you. And whether we could have comment from Mr. McKenzie confirming that the reason for the financial results being presented in the way they are is because they are required to be presented that way because of accounting standards.
That is, well, there's a combination of things. These are 6 monthly accounts, so we do have some flexibility. If anything, we actually provide more information than is required, but we'll take Councillor Van der Vis's point there and actually look at whether we can do this in a more user-friendly way in the future.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Speaking to the motion, Your Worship, briefly, I agree with Councillor Van der Vis insofar as I think that it is difficult for the layperson to understand the relationship between council, citizens, DCHL and subsidiaries. when I became a councillor, there was a process of learning that I had to go through, and it was a fair degree more complicated back then to come to terms with all of that. And I think Ms Mackenzie, thank you for saying that you will take on board that and trying to work through a more user-friendly approach to presenting 6 months results. That being said, however, it does not diminish the fact that these are positive results. It does not diminish the fact that the council companies, where they have where these 6 months have been less positive than last year, that is on the whole a budgeted, anticipated outcome as a result of the need to rebalance some of the, or to invest in some of the assets in some of those companies, and that has been well flagged to us over multiple years by the new directors that we have put in place into these entities. It has not only been well flagged, but it has been budgeted for. We have budgeted for a decreased revenue from the companies because we have recognised that situation and we have planned for it. That being said, there are also companies within the group that are delivering above expectations, and I think that we should celebrate that, and we should flag that, and we should thank those involved for ensuring that that has been the case. From my part, I think I'm really pleased with the way that the transition has gone, moving DVL and DVML into DCHL, the fact that we have done that in a staged way, whereby governance, we asked the governance team to take responsibility for it before the technical transaction took place to try to see whether or not that was working, and I'd like to commend staff for making that suggestion several years ago now, and thank those involved in making that technical transfer more recently, the smooth process that it has been to date, and fingers crossed that continues to be the case. I guess the only other issues that I'm keen to flag in relation to this report probably aren't matters for this report, but for the letter of expectations later on, so I will wait for those, but thank those involved in, I think, what is a very positive 6-month result for the companies.
Councillor Kell.
I'm pleased, and I thank the team over there for ever-increasing transparency and better books to us. I do think, however, that it's rather awkward to have a pattern whereby we have a report that comes to councillors behind closed doors, where we may or may not be told things that may or may not match up with what comes out in paperwork. And it doesn't allow us to be asking as useful questions or to help the public to understand better the situation we're in.
So would you like to be clear about what you're insinuating, Councillor?
I wasn't really meaning to insinuate something.
Well, then
I was meaning
you seem
that.
to have a problem saying what you mean,
Well,
so please perhaps.
If what we are being told in a briefing that the public is excluded from is exactly the same as in the accounts, then those briefings may as well be public. Let's have them public. The suggestion that we could ask questions a week ago, looking at them, it's not as good a process as being able to have that debate and those questions in a more public venue. And if we ask them in a less public venue, then do we know something we didn't know, and can we not ask a question? It's just a wee bit more awkward is what I'm saying. No, I wasn't intending to insinuate anything. There's also, with the DCHL reports, something that I would like to see a wee bit different. I do appreciate that Grant, in what might be sometimes a little uncomfortable, has a foot in each camp. inside council and with DCHL, and that's very useful to all of us. But I think that since our only interaction with any of the so-called council-controlled companies is through Mr. Crombie, I would prefer Mr. Crombie to get himself up to speed to answer our questions. He is the only real conduit we have between us and any of the companies. And so, although I appreciate Grant's technical ability to answer those questions, I would prefer that, especially if there's been any notice, and I apologise for not giving as much notice as I should have this time, that Grant could perhaps bring Mr. Crombie up to speed and he could actually answer to things with DCHL's accounts, because it's not Grant who is responsible to us. The only person we have any interaction with really is Mr. Crombie.
I would point out that Mr. Mackenzie is the Chief Financial Officer for DCHL, so he is precisely the person that I would have think we should go to if we want answers to financial questions. Councillor Staines.
Is this right?
Sorry?
Is it right to reply?
Oh, sorry, I thought you wanted to speak. So, Councillor Busy.
I'd just like to make a comment following on from Councillor Calvert. It's not just Mr. Crombie who's available and who is the person that relays the information certainly from DCHL and related to the other companies. But in my experience, I've been able to go to anybody on the board, any chairman, and always to the chairman of a holding company and ask questions. And it's never been a problem. So I'd hate for anyone to go away from here today, and especially the media, thinking that we don't have access to the members of our company and to our holding company, in particular, Mr. Crombie. He's available to anybody to ask questions. And indeed, in his public release today, he says, any questions for more information, Graham Crombie. People can go to him, and they can go to any member of the board anytime that they're available.
The speakers. Well, before I come back to the mover, I'd just like to endorse the comments, particularly from Councillor McTavish. This, if I cast my mind back to the reporting of and the performance of the companies 5 or 6 years ago, we have come a huge distance, both in terms of just one of the things with shareholder funds to total assets. It's basically doubled in a few years. The debt is being pushed down. The performance is consistent and is consistent with what has been budgeted. So we're doing what was planned. And if I think about our experience when I was first on council, it was a series of constant surprises. Sometimes you got a good surprise, but more often you got a not so good surprise. Now we don't get surprises. Now we know what's going on. And so it's much more transparent. And I'm intrigued that Councillor Vandervis says that he finds it difficult to understand these papers and yet manages to draw extremely clear conclusions from them. It's an odd way of operating. But I think this is a really good result. It's exactly what we were told would happen, and I'd like to pass on Councillor's thanks to the Board of DCHL for that achievement. Councillor Staines.
Thank you, Your Worship. I'd also like to echo the thanks to Mr. Crombie, the DCHL board, and the boards of the companies and the companies themselves for the result, and the fact that the result is consistent with what we have been briefed it would be, something that didn't used to happen in the past. I fail and struggle to understand why some councillors feel that they are not being briefed adequately. Since Mr. Crombie has taken over as chair of DCHL, our quarterly briefings are, in my opinion, way ahead of what we've ever had in the past. They keep us in the loop of commercial concerns that they might have and of commercial opportunities. And I also struggle to understand why some councillors, most of whom have businesses, feel that we should air commercially sensitive items in public at a time where airing those would result in a loss to our ratepayers. These are companies that will be working in areas where the information has to be kept tightly controlled until the outcome has reached a point where it can be publicly released. Yes, I would expect that these things should come out into the public, but I also accept, being a director of a number of companies, that you cannot air some of these things in public until they have been completed. Our role as governance is to be kept in the loop of those things and to be able to keep those things confidential. And I believe that we have been given the opportunity to share quite confidential information with Mr. Crombie in those quarterly reports, which has given me the comfort that the governance and management of those companies is being taken very seriously. I'd just like to make one correction to a comment that City Forest profit is up because of oil. It is not only oil. Yes, the fact that oil prices have gone down will be helping City Forests, as it will be helping the city itself. But the main reason, and for those who went to the briefing, would be that the China market has picked up and that the felling program has been accelerated to take advantage of that, and that has had a significant
Point of order.
input into the result.
What Mr. Stain said just now flies in the face of what Mr. Crombie said in today's media, which is along with reduced costs because of lower fuel levels and international...
That's not a point of order.
He is misleading council by saying the opposite of what Mr. Crombie said in today's media release.
It's not a point of order. Sit down. So it's been brought to my attention what the basis for your point of order might have been, although you didn't specify it, Councillor Vandervis, but I rule against it.
Sorry, you...
But I rule against it. I accept it was a point of order. So, Councillor, now we're through the discussion.
I was just going to make a point of order, although I'm not totally sure about point of order, so I was going to offer it to you and you can tell me whether it is or not.
Sure.
As in point of order, I think Councillor Staines has just been talking to the public about what we heard in a briefing, which I understood we weren't to do.
What's the basis of your point of order?
I thought we weren't supposed to be. I think Councillor Staines should withdraw any reference to a briefing that isn't supposed to be being discussed in public.
The fact that we had a briefing isn't confidential. What was said in it is...
That's what was said in it that Councillor Staines referred to.
So I've been advised that any information that Councillor Staines may or may not have released was in the press release. Had already been released by, so it didn't come from the briefing. So I decline point of order. Now I'm going to. It's been moved and seconded. I'm going to put it. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against?
No, recorded, please.
It's recorded, Councillor Vandervis. Right, so we're on to 16A, Aurora Energy Limited.
I'm happy to.
Sorry?
I was going to move them in bulk, if you wish.
Right, well, I'll tell you what, I think what we might do is that we work through them by way of questions and then I'll put them all together. So just, do you wish to say anything about any of them? So questions?
Could we deal with Delta first?
No, we'll just deal with them in the order. So Aurora Energy first, and then just ask any questions. And then if there's no questions from that, we'll just move down through the list, shall we? Any questions on Aurora? Any questions on City Forests? Any questions on Delta? Councillor Carroll.
So the questions I wanted to know earlier, and these are as a result of the article in the AUDIT, talking about the Noble subdivision, or Yaldhurst, whatever we're calling it. The first one is, what is the relationship between Gold Band and Delta, financial and in any other way?
So there is no relationship. The only thing they have in common is a overdue debt.
Overdue debt from Delta to Gold Band. I was talking about the relationship between
There is no
Delta.
there is no relationship between them. All they have is a common debt, which is overdue.
They're both fellow creditors.
Correct.
Has Delta any interest in any possible purchase of anything to do with the land in the Noble subdivision?
Delta is trying to exit that debt position.
I don't think you've answered my question, Mr. McKenzie. Has it got... What we've got at the moment is a mortgagee sale, and we've got what in the AUDIT was described as what might be a first charge, or what might not quite be, to Gold Band. And following the tender process, which closed last Friday, a comment by...
My point of order is that this is a discussion of a question not before the authority. This is about the accounts till the 31st of December, not something that's happening this year. My understanding that these are the accounts to this year.
Yeah, I uphold that, because if we ask questions on the basis of what's in the newspaper or anything else other than what's in our papers, we could be here all day, so I uphold that order. So please restrict your questions to...
That's a separate issue to what Councillor Wilson's saying, as to whether we restrict our questions to things before December.
The matter that is before us, I think this is the nub of the point of order. The matter that is before us are the accounts of Aurora Energy. So please restrict your questions to that.
Not exactly.
More particularly
Delta, in this case.
more particularly to the 31st of December 2015. We don't have what's happening now on our agenda.
So please restrict your questions.
So what do we know, please, about who is owed what, which we would have known, I would have thought, in December? Who is owed what to the Noble subdivision, and in what order they could expect to be paid?
Sorry, we don't have that information. It's not publicly available. You'd have to talk to Noble about that. What we do know is that Delta has a first mortgage position, and then subsequent mortgage positions after that.
Sorry, when you say a first mortgage position alongside, there are two first mortgages, one to Gold Band and one to Delta?
We know that Gold Band is another first mortgage. I don't know who else.
And we're not expecting they would be paid before us?
I can't comment. Well, first mortgage position, you'd always expect your first mortgage.
But if you're
So
both first
I'm fully sure
mortgages,
that
you would
we-
expect to be both paid, either both of you if there was enough money, or equally, in proportion to your...
Well, that's the normal process.
Yes, I'm asking whether it's the process in this particular case.
I can't comment.
Sorry, if we're dealing with the accounts to the 31st of December 2015, I think the question should be, in order to be on the point of what discussion of the question not before us, was it paid within that time frame? If it wasn't, then we can't ask that question. because this is about the financials of the companies till the 31st of December 2015. I appreciate there's another discussion to be had, but I don't think it's fair to be having it under this item.
And I think, Councillor Calvert, that your questions have been answered as well. I mean, I think they're largely rhetorical. I mean, you know the answers to these questions. You know,
actually,
you know that.
no, Your Worship. The thing is here that
just restrict your questions to these accounts, please.
Yes, well, these accounts have money that's owed to us, and we have to try and ascertain, somebody has to, and I'm sure people with better minds than I have been thinking about it, as to what likelihood we will have of getting...
I'm just going to rule the point of order. I don't, that's, as far as I'm concerned, I'm upholding the point of order. That's not an acceptable question. Please move on to the next one and make it pertinent to the papers.
Are we owed the 13,000 or whatever it is on top of an 11,000 that we already think is a doubtful debt?
11,000.
11 million, sorry. Sorry, we appear to have impaired the 11, and so they're sort of taken out of the books because we think it's doubtful. On top of that, we're also owed 13 is the question.
If I just reiterate what I said before, so an independent valuation was done of the amount that potentially the area could be dealt with. Delta has a debt sitting there at 13.3 million recorded in the accounts. That, when the valuers looked at that and said that is acceptable as what we believe, they would clear back from that process. Audit New Zealand, as part of the audit process, went through and assessed the methodology used to come to that number, and that's the number that was acceptable in the financial statements. The question you're asking, and Grant alluded to earlier, I think, is that under accounting standards we are required to charge penalty interest on the amount outstanding, but with the assessment at 13.3 million, we impair that back to that number so that that is recognised as we go along. So the number sitting in the accounts is 13.3, and that's the piece that the independent assessors have said we would recover out of that process.
So we think 11 of the 13 is doubtful?
No, the number outstanding now is 13.3, and the independent assessors, the valuer, and then the auditors who have reviewed that process, assess that as a collectible amount. That is why it's in the accounts at that number.
So it was only ever 13.3?
No, as I said before, as the outstanding amount, we then charge penalty interest on that as we go through the year, and has been going for the last 6 or 7 years, whatever it is. And then at the end of the year, the directors of that company are required to make an assessment of what they could collect of that amount, and then they impair, which means they take the amount outstanding, including penalty interest, and bring that back to the amount they believe is collectible. The difference from the penalty interest back to the collectible amount will show as an impairment cost in the accounts. Okay, so that's the expense. The balance outstanding, which is 13.3 million, is the piece assessed by the valuers and the auditors, as that is recoverable by the company.
Thank you. So it was up to, with one thing and another, a total of 24 and ended up at 30.
It's never got
I'll talk to you about it later because this is boring people about this, I'm sure.
I think the important piece is the number in the accounts is 13.3 million. That's the amount assessed by the independent valuer and the independent auditor, and the reason for the movements around are penalty interest charges, which are horrendous.
And one last question, is any of the money in that 13 or that 11 or any of the things to do with Noble money we have put in, bought into, done anything else like that with, other than just the work we did and interest that has been charged on it? Does it include any other money? Have we put any back into it? Or
So the company has put some money into it to strengthen its position, particularly when it comes to the ranking of debt. So they took out a first mortgagee party last year.
For how much, please?
I don't have the figure off the top of my head, sorry.
If I could get it later, that'll be good.
I would suggest that that may be confidential information in any case. Councillor Van, if you have a question.
Mr. Crombie, you said in the 18th of March last year in a AUDIT story, this is all relating to accounts of Delta prior to 31/12/15 to keep Councillor Hughson at bay. You said that Delta is confident of being paid a significant portion of a potential bad debt worth millions of dollars. You've just now referred to horrendous penalty charges. Can you put a figure on what those penalty charges are?
No, I can't, but as I indicated, that's probably irrelevant. So they're under the contract. The amount outstanding in the accounts of 13.3 is the amount considered recoverable.
When you say they're irrelevant, are they irrelevant in terms of what's recoverable or irrelevant in terms of what the ratepayers had to pay in interest over the last 6 years on unpaid accounts?
That's not a question that I expect Mr. Crombie to have to answer. Ask the next one.
Right. Are you aware of Delta having bought $1.5 million worth of gold bands for first mortgage?
Is this in these accounts at all? Is it referenced?
This is prior to 31.
Is it referenced in these accounts?
No, it isn't referenced, but it is relevant to these accounts because it
Move on to the next question.
Your Honour, I have asked a question of the accounts of Delta prior to 31/12/15, and I believe that prior to 31/12/15, Delta bought $1.5 million worth of gold band finance mortgage. Is that true or is it not?
In 6 months.
I've indicated that there's no reason for them to answer the question.
All right, I will put another question then. Is it also true that Avanti Finance, also involved in the Noble subdivision, had $1.5 million worth of mortgage bought prior to 31/12 by Delta?
Same instruction. Let's move on.
One of the main reasons that I have not attended your briefings, Your Honour, Your Worship, sorry, easy mistake to make given the judgments that have been coming down. One of the reasons...
They're not my briefings.
And yet you don't permit me to speak in them and throw me out of them anyway.
Councillor, if you've got any more questions, answer them. If you haven't, please sit down. You're delaying the meeting. You appear to be completely off the subject now of these accounts. So if you've got any more questions on these accounts, please ask them, and then we can get them.
Prior to 31/12/15, was ex-Delta Director Mike Coburn employed as a consultant on the Noble subdivision?
In this financial year.
Next question.
Sorry, I don't know if I got an answer.
You didn't.
If I'm not to get any answers to these questions, I don't think there's a lot of point any of us being here.
Excellent. Dunedin City Treasurer, any questions on that?
Sorry, Bishop, I do have a question about City Forest.
Oh, sure.
You
All right.
skipped over. Just asking Mr. Crombie, you referred to some logging operations being brought forward to make the most of high prices at present. Is it likely that that will have a equal and opposite effect over the next 12, 18 months? Are we likely to see an impact on revenue streams because there is less forest available to log in future years?
I think it's intended by City Forest that they come back on their cut for the year, which is about 300,000 cubic metres, or whatever the number is. So they're slightly ahead of the 6 months cut, and we'll come back to that. That was to take advantage of better pricing from there. We're currently in Chinese New Year, which slows down the market in China, and a whole lot of stuff pulls back there. So their intention is that by 30th of June they will be back on their cyclic cut, so that's the sustainable piece, and that will have an effect on bringing back the positive variance to budget, but they're expecting to be slightly ahead of budget at the end of the year.
Further questions? Right. And as I said, I would invite someone to move all of these together.
That's one recommendation.
One
Sorry,
recommendation.
Worship, I'm happy to move as per the order paper on 16.1.
Second to Councillor Staines. Any discussion? I'll put all those in favour, please say aye. Against?
Abstain, and I wish to abstain, and I wish to have the reason for my abstention recorded, that I cannot get my very specific questions answered in this forum or any other.
Right. On to item 17. And you're still in the hot seat. Oh, you're gone. Well, I'm going to tell you. Right. Item 17, Dunedin City Council letter of expectations.
Yep. All right. So thank you. A couple of things here. I guess clarification of what's happening next with this particular piece of work is that if council today decides that this is an appropriate letter to send, and I always say that with bated breath, we will then, the letter will be sent to DCHL. DCH will then discuss this with the subsidiaries, and more than likely write to them as well to look at their specific areas of that we need to pass on to them. We will then have a council workshop where we can have all around the table to have a discussion about what the appropriate thing is, and then bring that back to the June meeting. Also, the thing that you need to be aware of is that we need to update the budgets, because the budget's cycle is slightly out compared to council, so that will then also feed into the statement of statement of intent process. I'll get there sometime. I'll shut up now.
Questions, councillors? Councillor McTash.
So, sorry, just to be clear then, the process from here, the letter of what we have in front of us in terms of statements of intent, which are a later item, not related, well, but related to this item, they are draft statements of intent. We will expect them to be redrafted on the basis of feedback received today and this letter of expectations and the strategic framework workshop, which this letter of expectations refers to.
Correct.
Thank you.
Councillor Banks.
In attachment A on 17.4, it says the letter does not create any legal or binding obligations on the parties. Does that in effect mean that this is more of a sort of suggestion and that we'd have no teeth to enforce anything here?
Effectively what it's saying is that this is setting out council's expectation of the company. Obviously they are individual entities, so therefore they can continue to trade as they feel fit, but council has the ultimate say there in the fact that you appoint, or DCHL appoints the directors, but you then appoint the DCHL directors.
So I think I've asked this question of you before. If the council companies don't do as we ask and go outside their statement of intent, our only recourse is to fire the directors of DCHL. Is that the case?
Correct.
Given that...
Can I just add something by way of...
Please.
In order to help with this. My understanding is what we're talking about here is a letter of expectation. And my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, the letter doesn't create any legal or binding obligation. What it creates, though, is an obligation on the companies to come back with a statement of intent which reflects the requests that we put into our statement of expectation. And at that point, I would have thought council could say, no, this isn't what we put into our letter of expectation. So I think that's where the obligation is. This is a step in the process, as it mentions in the following sentences.
So what you're saying is that the crunch will come with the SOIs?
The first crunch will come, yes.
Okay. Except that historically that hasn't happened in my experience on City Council, for instance.
Except that we've never sent them a letter of expectation before either.
No, I'm talking about the SOIs. We've had SOIs in the past.
Yes, but we've never sent a letter of expectation to elicit an SOI. Never done that before. This is the first time we've done this. This is a way of focusing their letter of statement of intent more precisely to what we want. That's the point.
Given that previous statement of intents have basically been ignored in million-dollar amounts, what comfort can we take that this letter will actually, apart from informing the statement of intents, actually do anything to make those statement of intents meaningful?
I can't say what will happen. I don't accept your premise in the first instance. I can't say what's happening. What I'm explaining is the process as the council sees it in endeavouring to tighten up a process in the past where we made no expectation and expected them to read our minds and come back to it with a statement of intent that we want.
Do you not accept, Your Worship, that DVML went out and bought $1.2 million worth of seats outside of the SOI?
I'm not getting into those arguments. I'm just saying this process is what we're talking about, is endeavouring to tighten up the statements of intent.
Good luck.
Further, Councillor Rick.
Yeah, I just have a couple of specific questions on the text. Under corporate goals, the text reads, the principal goal of Council Controlled Trading Organisation, CCTO, is, and I'm just seeking clarification from Mr Mackenzie as to whether or not that reference is intended to be to DCHL, so Organisation 1, or whether it is referring to DCHL and subsidiaries, in which case we should probably change is to R and add an S after CCTO.
This letter is intended to go to DCHL in the first instance,
yeah.
So it is for DCHL.
So given that, would it make sense to change that opening sentence to read the principal goal of Dunedin City Holdings Limited is to operate as a successful long-term business?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I guess I was a little hesitant to make that suggestion because I think that what we want to signal is that this is something that we wish to see flowing through subsidiary SOIs as well. But I think given that this section refers to the specific corporate goals of the CCTO being DCHL, yeah, we probably just need to think about wordsmithing it in some way. I'm not sure, maybe Chief Exec, you might have a suggested approach which would capture both of those things.
Okay, can I suggest that the way through this is for you to move this when it's appropriate, move the recommendation with an amendment to the wording.
I will talk to the Chief Exec, see if I can find some wording.
Yep. Councillor Calvert.
I'm a bit confused, sort of, I can see where it's going, but it starts off saying it's an agreement, which usually wouldn't be a letter because it would be signed by two lots of people if it's an agreement between somebody and someone else, and goes on to say it doesn't create any obligations. So I'm wondering whether its purpose is not sort of quite what it was wanting to be, because as a letter of expectation, its general tenor is that this is what we are saying to you, it's our responsibility to write this, or change it how we want, and we are saying what we understand is that this is what we want you to do, this is what we want as a shared thing, this is what we will do, but it isn't in any terms an agreement. If it was an agreement, if it were an agreement, it would be signed by both lots of us, and it would be proposed to them to see if they agree to it. It says it's an agreement. It isn't an agreement, I don't think. I think it's us saying, this is what we expect from the relationship we have with you. Have I got it wrong, or are those words? Is an agreement on the parties' respective accountabilities and things. I just don't think it is that. It's not an agreement at all.
Look, I think it's an agreement in that we agree that this is what this is called. This is what this includes. It's not an agreement in the sense of a contract. So I don't think, I think that you could say it's ambiguous, but you're taking one meeting and I think it makes perfect sense to call it an agreement. Councillor Reverend.
Well, I don't think it is an agreement. I think this is a good idea. And as you say, Your Worship, it is the first time that we've done it. And it is just a statement of intent that we would like the DCHL to look at what we would like when their statement of intent comes back to us. What happened before, we didn't send this, the statement of intent came back, and then we had the debate, and we said, no, we don't agree with that. Then we'd go back to the companies, and they would change it if they felt they were obliged to or wanted to. Then it would come back, so there was all this toing and froing. I think this is a good idea, and it'll clarify the issue. It actually will address some of the concerns that Councillor Vandervis has raised from time to time. So I think it's a good idea. I'm prepared to move this, and I know Councillor McTavish has got an amendment, and I will let her do it, but I support this.
Well, bear in mind it's no question time, but I'll take it as a question. Councillor Hawkins.
Yeah, thank you, and thanks Grant, and thanks for alleviating my concerns that this letter of expectations would be too late to have any impact on the statements of intent for this year. Given the timing of the workshop that you've proposed, will the second draft of any of the statements of intent that flows on from this, the first we'll see of them will be the June council meeting?
Correct.
At which point it will be too late to amend them because they need to be signed off by the end of the financial year?
That is correct. Well, having the workshop, that's where we should have the feedback loop coming in. Right. But the intention is that the June council meeting is the meeting that would all be signed off at.
And I'm very optimistic that our feedback will be taken on board and accommodated in the second draft, but we can't take that for granted, obviously. Is it intended in future years for that process to happen earlier so that it would inform perhaps this draft?
Correct.
Right.
Yeah. And unfortunately, given the timing of when we've done the letter of expectation, when we had the workshop late last year, we had the other workshop in January, which has meant we've been able to get it to this meeting. It's then meant that we've haven't been able to feed this back to the subsidiaries for them to build it into their statements of intent, which is what we'd want next year, the fact that they're built in there. And then when we're having the discussion now, you can then actually hold on a heavy thought of A, B and C.
That's great. And hopefully look forward to having that conversation. While this hasn't been delivered, this letter, because it hasn't been signed, none of the contents of it will be a surprise to the Holdings Company Board?
The Holdings Company Board have been aware that there's been a letter of expectation. They're not aware of what's been in it. It's, as Councillor Calvert said earlier today, I can be one of the most conflicted persons in the room, but I try and keep those conflicts apart. So.
So we've addressed your agreement issue.
I understand Councillor McTavish as yes, Your Worship.
Right, are there any other questions? All right, the resolution is up on the board, on the wall, and the changes to corporate goals set there. And the wording change around the second line under purpose, where agreement is changed to outlines expectations, is that what you said?
Yeah, so the to accommodate Councillor Calvert's concerns, it's suggested that we change the wording to read this letter of expectations, the letter provides the DCC's annual direction to DCHL outlining expectations of the parties' respective accountabilities, roles and responsibilities.
All right. You're moving this, Councillor McTavish. Is there a seconder? Councillor Calvert. Speakers. Would you like to speak to it, Councillor McTavish?
Just very briefly, Your Worship. It feels good to have this in front of us. I think we've been talking about it for a solid couple of years now, and I think the auditor will also be pleased to see this, because I understand that it was part of conversations with the auditor last time round. Personally, I think it's signalling a strong intention to work with our companies along more strategic lines, and that I think can only deliver better outcomes for the city as a whole moving forward. The intention here to place in front of the companies the suite of aspirations that we have as a city, as encapsulated by our strategic framework, to put that in front of the companies and say, how are you delivering on these? Because you currently are in many ways. How do we celebrate that? And on the other hand, are there other opportunities for you to engage with us as a city to help deliver on these strategic objectives? For me, that's really exciting. It's enhancing the work that we can do as a collective to deliver outcomes. I mean, even if you just look at something like City Forests and look at the fact that it is already delivering significant strategic benefits for our city from a recreation perspective, from a biodiversity perspective, potentially in the future from an energy perspective, from an economic development perspective, there are a range of opportunities, and as much as anything we have been missing a framework to have the good engagement with the companies that is required to unlock that. We've had in place this statement of intent process for some years now, and I agree with Councillor van der Vis that it has had really severe limitations. It has in effect been a bit of a one-way conversation. This sets the framework for a two-way dialogue about that strategic framework and how we can work collaboratively to deliver on it. So I'm really excited by this. Thank you to staff for the work, that's not insignificant work that's gone on to get it to this point. And I really look forward to the engagement with the companies, Mr. Crombie, that will come following this. Yeah, thank you.
Councillor van der Vis.
I entirely agree with Councillor McTavish that this is a feels-good document, but I worry that it is only a feel-good document. I worry, for instance, that on page 17.5 it says that got to keep the shareholder informed of matters of substance, acquisition, disposal and asset greater than 10 million. Given that all that we had was 8 million out of this company this year, I think that figure is far too high. But what worries me really overall is that this document has no teeth. There's no legal force behind it, and historically there hasn't been a practical force behind even making the suggestion and hoping that they would be going with such a suggestion. It's encapsulated to me in the last line on 17.6, where it says the DCC is accountable for undertaking reviews of this letter and monitoring its implementation. Monitoring the implementation of these kind of very fine goals, and I commend whoever was the wordsmith because they've actually been quite nicely put. But monitoring them is not something which I as a councillor have the potential to do or have had the potential to do. And even when I have been able to find some of the gross sidesteppings of statement of intent requirements, bringing them up non-publicly and then making them public, even then, nothing ever got done. I'm reminded of a chief executive from, I think, New Plymouth, who visited us once and characterised the CCO experience that she had as not one of council-controlled organisations, but of council-controlling organisations. And since I was first elected in 2004, that's been very much my experience as well. Now, I do hope that this letter, hopefully an agreement, will make some difference, but I can't see how it can, given that our monitoring potential is not available, and the only answer we have if we're unhappy with the way DCHL goes is to dispose of directors. So I'll vote for it, but for anyone taking comfort in this, it's just feel good.
Councillor Wilson.
Thank you, Worship. I'm really pleased to see this here. I have to say that I'm disappointed that your conflicts probably have meant that you haven't taken to the companies so far and perhaps given us a flavour of what could have been in this to date, in the statements of intent in the next section, because I think when this was workshopped and when we had the discussions about this, and Councillor McTavish has already given some examples, how vibrant the city can look and how positive a contribution these companies are actually making at a triple line level rather than just the financial level. And while I think it's often said that Councillor Vandervis wants to live in the past, going forward, which is our role in setting much better forward-looking documents, this is an opportunity for us to put in place and recognise the great things that Tyree Gorge do, that very much community-driven at times, the great things not only the City Forest do, that Delta, and it's exciting. I think today we've received an invitation to the first fast charging station to be open next week. That's really exciting stuff where it's talking to our strategic plan, integrated transport strategy. The companies are delivering it in a really exciting way. I've just been in Auckland and to see their first charging station up there and knowing we're going to be right up there behind them and providing a service that's going to take this city along with New Zealand into electric car charging in a really exciting way is really, really neat. I see that stuff as something that's forward focused. I see it as something that could have been in the draft statements of intents as examples. They're not, but that's fine. And that I think it fills me with some confidence that once those are in the statements of intent, when the companies come back, that we will have KPIs or a part of their annual reports that will talk to those, that will be a very monitorable way of seeing the difference that the companies do. I also finally want to just, I've never heard one of our council papers ever been made into a prayer before, and I have to say I took some joy listening to the Reverend today, going through our strategic framework as a prayer. Wouldn't it be great if we all positively looked at that and thought of it in such terms? And what gives me great heart is that these statements of intent, leading expectations being based on those strategies, gives us the opportunity of making some really forward positive changes to the bigger council group, which is, I think, going to be something that we haven't focused on nearly enough in the past. So I'm really excited by it. This isn't the time to get really excited. I've never got excited by statements of intent. It's what we get back next time, which I'm really looking forward to. Mr. Crombie may be rather nervous with my expectations, however.
Any further speak? Councillor Peck.
Thank you, Your Worship. I support this too. I'm probably not as excited as Councillor McTavish and Councillor Wilson, but nonetheless it's an important thing to do, to signal to our holding company and the companies themselves what we expect of them in terms of their goals. There's only one area that kind of just disturbs me at times when I read through statements of intent, and I don't, in the specific objectives, and I understand, you know, they're not going to release anything that's commercially sensitive. They're not going to signal something that's going to be an issue for them. But if they could just sharpen their pencils a little bit more and get things that are not just simply reflecting compliance with legislation, or you know, we're going that are just basically generic things, and they don't seem specific to me sometimes. When you get to some companies like Dunedin Airport, they have a list of performance measures, and they are very specific, and you can measure those. So I just think my comment would be, just for those companies that are trundling out specific objectives, just using generic things that you would say are worthy of their corporate goals or whatever, that, just that maybe they could sharpen their pencil a bit, that's all.
Well, before I come back to the mover, I'm very supportive of this. I find myself sympathising with some of the apprehensions expressed around the table by Councillor Vandervis and others, in that up till now, in the past, it has been a one-way street. But it has been a little bit unfair of council to expect certain things of the companies if we're not prepared to tell them what we want from them. And that's what this statement of intent does. To take the letter of expectation does. The test of the success of this will be what comes back in the statement of intent, and it's a first step. And if what comes back in the statements of intent isn't up to scratch, then we will need to sharpen our pencil, we will need to be more specific. But it's the start of an ongoing conversation. And I think that we have an obligation, as we represent the ultimate shareholder, the ratepayer, we have an obligation to do two things. We have an obligation to say quite clearly to the companies what we expect of them, but we also have an obligation to give them credit for the things that have been mentioned around the table that they are already doing. I was in a meeting with the chairs of the various companies, and with a little bit of introspection and coaxing, it was surprising the number of activities and that their companies were involved in that were for the benefit of the city, that had nothing to do with the financial bottom line, and they were just taken for granted and not even mentioned in many cases. And in some cases, quite surprised to find that they were doing a whole heap of stuff that was for the benefit of the community. So I think we have the obligation to put demands on them, be quite clear, but we have an obligation to give them credit when they are contributing to our community as they have been, and to find ways, as other speakers have mentioned, to work together, because we're all on the same page here. The companies belong to the ratepayers, and they're there for the benefit of the ratepayers, and they should serve the interests, the long-term interests of the ratepayers. So I support this as a very good first step. Councillor McTavish, your reply.
Thank you, Your Worship. The only comment that I wish to make is just in relation to Councillor Peake's comment, which I wholeheartedly endorse, that the specific objectives listed in the draft SOIs are not specific enough, and that sharpening our pencils, I think, is precisely what this letter of expectations is about, or providing the pencil sharpener perhaps is more the role that we are playing. But I'm very much hoping that this will roll through into much more specific objectives in those statements of intent, and the opportunity is there for us to provide that strategic framework conversation in order to enable those to be quite broad-ranging, I think, as well as addressing legislative requirements, also addressing a wider suite of the opportunities for our companies to contribute.
Okay, I'm going to put it, and just to clarify, the wording is on, the changed wording is on the wall with regard to the second line of the letter of expectation, where it's outlining expectations of the parties rather than agreement, and then the corporate goals have been expanded, so that's what we're voting on. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against? Carried. Thank you. Okay, we're on to item 18. The draft statement of intent from Dunedin City Holdings Limited. Graham, you come back. That's where you hang around. Would you like to pick off with anything?
I guess just to me, I think just to reiterate the process we're in, these drafts were done before receiving the letter, and we don't know what's in it. So from there, but it's just a reiteration. These are the first cut of the drafts. Your feedback will come back through both the workshop piece and I assume any other methods from there, and the final ones will come back to you June council meeting. So that's where we're at.
So I know you have outlined it a little, Mr. McKenzie, but could you just outline again the process from here? Because the way I see it, these draft statements of intent and the letter of expectation are both fed into a workshop.
Correct.
And what comes out will be the refined statements of intent.
That is correct, and also what we're looking at doing is actually having a more standard template, and ironically a number of councils have picked up on the Dunedin International Airport one, because when we've looked at it from DCHL's point of view, that's the one that stood out to us and says actually what they're doing actually gives a clearer alignment of what should and shouldn't be done. So we've started a template that we'll be discussing with the subsidiaries, but we also want to have that discussion with councils as well. The other comment I do need to make is that the financial numbers, as I said earlier, they're going to start the CCTOs are going through their budgeting processes now, so they need to be updated as well. So.
All right, I'll open up questions before someone moves. Are there any questions on this draft statement of intent? Councillor McTavish.
It's just in relation to the recommendations. So recommendation A, as it currently stands, noting the draft statement of intent for DCHL, would it be better to note that the draft statement of intent for DCHL for the 2016-17 year will be amended based on feedback upon receipt of the letter of expectations, given that what we see here will be amended?
I guess I thought that was covered off by next steps.
Right, yeah, okay. And in terms of B, provides comments if required, is it a request that we itemise those by way of resolution, or is it, how would you like us to deal with that recommendation?
So effectively what we're talking about there is that would be the first of, we'll be having a workshop
right
before the 1st of May.
So you're happy for it to
it's
be...
supposed to be getting set up this afternoon, so.
Thank you.
Further questions? All right, there are none. So would someone like to move the recommendation? Move Councillor Staines, second Councillor Hawkins. Discussion?
Well, I'm not sure if those recommendations necessarily make sense for us to move, as it were.
Why?
Well, simply because maybe it would make more sense if we read that the council will provide comments on the draft statement of intent by way of workshop, or because at the moment it just is a request rather than a stated intention.
Okay. So that the council notes and notes that councillors will provide comments by way of a workshop on the draft statement of intent by 1st of May.
I'd take the Chief Executive's feedback on.
Right, is everyone happy with that? It just makes it a little clearer. Okay, no discussion. I'm going to put it. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Against? Carried. Okay, we now will move on to 19A to H. These are the draft statements of intent for the companies, the subsidiary companies. Is there anything different you want to say, Graham, about that? So it's exactly the same situation, and I assume that it would be prudent to change the wording in the same way of the recommendation. So,
just ensuring that it's council, not councillors, that council will provide.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Are there any further questions? So would someone like to move this? Move for Councillor Staines, second to Councillor Lord. Is there any discussion? The same wording as prior. I'll put it. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Yes? Carried. That's A to H, by the way. Right, we're on to item 20. Thank you, Graham. When are you moving away? This is yours. Right. So the councillors are on to conflicts of interest policy, item 20. Welcome, Ms. Russia, Ms. Graham. Would you like to give some context?
Sure.
Only if you want to. Or
Yeah, just very quickly, that if I could. This report and this policy has been through the Audit and Risk Subcommittee and was considered by them in September. At that time, the Auditor General released the findings into the Queenstown Lakes District Council investigation, and so we took on board some of the comments from that investigation and modified the policy to ensure that we were meeting what is now considered best practice from the office, and the policy was reconsidered by the Audit and Risk Committee at its January meeting. This is the outcome of that review from that subcommittee.
Thank you. Questions, councillors? Councillor Noon.
Thank you, Your Worship. On page 20.8, under 6.3, prohibitive activities, C, disposal of the property to another employee, etc. Have you thought about the scenario where a staff member may be involved in an auction or a tender process where the purchaser is unknown and it may just happen to be a personal friend that ends up through that process and the staff member would actually be in breach of the policy? So have you thought about, it's a technical breach I suppose, it's not intentional, but they would get caught up in that potentially?
There are a number of things that we would look to do to minimise the risk of that happening, and that's part of what we're proposing in developing procedures for implementing this, because we haven't gone into exactly how some of it will work. But for example, we could identify on Trade Me that it was council property. If we were selling it through a website like that, we could say this item is council property, and that way, at least if it was a staff member, they would know that this policy existed, because that will be part of our communication plan with them. We'll have identified the property as being council property, for example.
I suppose the issue is, from a staff member's point of view, they may end up in a situation where they have the finger pointed at them and through no fault of their own, it's just circumstances that have unfolded through no fault of their own, and all I'm trying to ensure is that there is some way to identify in that situation where it just evolves that they're not in breach of the policy.
In developing the procedures, that's what is to ensure that they're as fair as they can be, because this is aimed at just in transparency and keeping people safe. It's not aimed to trap them. The whole aim of this policy is to ensure that people don't find themselves in those situations and they have an opportunity to declare interests early on.
I'm not sure whether the point I'm trying to make is that the staff member has got no idea who's going to buy the property, okay? It goes to tender, it goes to auction.
To disclose if they know they've got an interest.
And they have to disclose once they know they've got an interest. So if you're 3/4 of the way through a process and then suddenly you realise you have an interest, at that point, under the policy, you raise it and your group manager works with you to manage it. Yeah. So that will be quite comfortably covered.
Okay.
And actually won't be uncommon, I suspect.
The worst case scenario is an auction. Who knows until the hammer drops whether there is a conflict. So that's the one I'm really trying to highlight. That's all.
Yes, but if the staff member doesn't know the person is going to be at the auction and is managing equally to all parties, then in that sense there's no preferential treatment that arrives for one party. If the staff member, on the other hand, is telling their friend, hey, that this is what the reserve is going to be, then that becomes an issue. So as long as our staff are behaving in that impartial way, then this won't breach the policy.
Councillor Hawkins.
Thank you. I have a question of my own, but Councillor Wilson's getting very agitated also about 6.3.1c, and she would like to know whether council can be inserted so it says disposal of council property to another employee, to make that perfectly clear. Okay, got it.
Right.
My question relates to 6.4.1. Employees may not be involved with the following activities unless they have the consent of their group manager, general manager or chief executive officer. C, making submissions to council processes, including public forums in a private capacity, which to me seems incredibly broad, particularly given the definition of employee used in the policy to cover all volunteers and contractors. And I wonder if any thought had been given to narrowing that perhaps to the scope of employment rather than the outcome we have now where a cleaner can't come to us and make a submission on our environment strategy, or the City of Literature because technically they are an employee and that would be making a submission to a council process in their personal capacity.
This was discussed by the Audit and Risk Subcommittee, and they felt that the policy provided appropriate management plans in that situation. So it's not that they're precluded from submitting, there's just a process they will have to follow to get any possible conflict or interest managed in advance of submitting.
On what grounds would that be declined were it outside the scope of that person's employment to justify including it at all?
That's partly why we will now go through a process to look at how we implement some of these things. But the Audit and Risk Committee were clear that this was something that they thought needed to be included to give this policy a degree of robustness.
How does this differ from current procedure? And is there a problem that this is seeking to address?
So my understanding is that this isn't any different to what we currently do. When there are major processes such as the 2GP recently, the Chief Executive gave advice to staff about the appropriate manner in which to handle their interest and in making a submission on that process. So this is simply reflecting current practice as far as I've been advised.
And that is understandable when it comes to direct employees of the council. But how broadly is that message received in terms of contractors and volunteers who are also captured by this? And what confidence do you have that they would have the knowledge and capacity to find a relevant general manager, group manager or chief executive to get clearance to come and make a submission or speak in a public forum as part of a council process?
It will be difficult, and as we look at how we're going to implement it, it might be that we refine this somewhat in the procedures, especially with volunteers and some of the contractors. But again, it is for the group manager or general manager to be aware as best they can be.
And that is the group manager or general manager. In the case of the contractor, who do they report to? The relevant general manager or group manager that oversees that contract, or the procurement manager, or who?
It's generally the relevant manager who is overseeing their contract, and they'll be aware of who that is.
All of our contractors' staff will be aware of who the relevant group manager is that oversees their contract?
The manager of the contract. As I said, we'll have to look at the implementation of this.
Thank you.
Councillor Wilson, do you have any questions that you don't want to channel through Councillor Williams?
I have the standards here. I just want to understand the background, and I appreciate this has gone through audit and risk and that process. And my problem is that the pendulum sometimes swings too far when we do these things, wanting to correct a worse situation, and we correct it into a perverse one. And just understanding how this and my voting on this would be in conflict to the conflict of interest that we have, because we have a relationship with staff all the time. And would I be right in saying that our conflict of interest is one that we need to turn our minds to, but we have to declare it, and if we don't think we've got a conflict, and we're at the quietly different end as elected arm of council, that ours is a very much one that we identify ourselves, and generally it's up to us to declare that, as opposed to being prescriptive.
A couple of things. You have the Local Authority Members Interest Act, which sets a statutory framework for how some of your interests have to be managed, which we don't have as council officers, but also as part of a review of the conflict of interest policy for officers, the Audit and Risk Subcommittee has asked that we look at, and it's one of the recommendations in the report, that we look at how we are dealing with and the policy for elected members' conflicts of interest as well, and we look at separating them potentially from the standing orders into a separate document to have the same kind of clarity for elected members.
Appreciate all that. Am I right at the moment, though, that as ours goes, while we've got the Local Government Members Act, we also have to declare ours? It's quite at the other end of the spectrum. Then this is quite prescriptive about how this works and is controlled, whereas at the moment we have to self-manage to an extent our own conflicts, and yet we're requiring much a higher standard of...
So, councillors, yes, there has been a degree of self-management for both elected members and staff. The Auditor General has made it extremely clear, as particularly in the last series of reports they've released on the subject, that it is no longer expected that it's managed in that way. In fact, our expectation is to prescribe this method. In terms of comparing, so is to prescribe how conflicts will be managed, how they'll be disclosed and how they'll be dealt with. The policy as it applies to staff is quite detailed, and that is because we don't have the legislative framework, but of course the elected members do, such as the Local Authority Members' Interests Act. So this is, in some respects, capturing some of those principles and introducing them to staff at that level.
But you have seen recommendations C in the covering report.
Councillor Paul, you're right. Councillor Peake.
Yeah, thank you to the staff and the committee for bringing this report to us. I think it's very. I think it's needed anyway. And I just have some questions. Am I right in thinking this is the first conflict of interest for council officers policy? I know you have a standards of conduct. Is that right? And does it sit alongside that? I'm just wondering what the relationship is.
This is a consolidation of a policy that has existed in a number of places. So there's been aspects of it in the tendering and procurement purchasing areas, parts of it in the staff code of conduct. So this is a pulling together of it from various places, and it is we are using the principles in this already. For example, in tenders board and all the stuff that's considered by tenders board.
Sure. Just then, if I may, just a question that's very specific and to do with definition. So page 20.6, I just take you down to 4.4D, and it's a question about whether a measurement of strongly held a view or opinion is going to be able to be made. I would have thought that just an opinion or view, I mean the important part is that does that opinion or view, whether it's strongly held or not, affect a transaction or a process? And I'm just wondering whether that's, do we need that in there? You'd have to start measuring the strength of the held opinion or view, one would think.
I'm not sure I'd want to make that change on the spur of the moment. The point of this is most staff have, well, some of my staff have a not insignificant opinion on a range of issues, and myself included. There's a point at which that's held strongly enough to begin to interfere and to create a conflict of interest. So that's what this is trying to say here. It's both halves of the sentence work together. A strongly held opinion in and of itself is not necessarily a problem, but if it's strong enough that it interferes with your ability to be impartial, then it is a problem. So I guess it's, this having been through Audit and Risk Committee and them having been comfortable with it, I'd be rather loath to just change it on a dime without further discussion, unless somebody thinks it's particularly problematic.
Councillor McTavish.
Thank you, Your Worship. I have a number of concerns with this document. I guess one of the more specific ones is relating to 4.4e. So this includes, but is not limited to, situations where the person, whether actual or perceived, has been lobbied by an interested party through comments, either formally or informally, where the interested party is intending to present a certain point of view. Well, I can say with absolute certainty that that happens to me every day and is likely to happen to staff every day on all range of issues. And without some kind of clarifying subclause where it is pertinent to a transactional process, that is an exceptionally broad statement to be requiring people to declare actual or perceived conflicts in relation to. That was a statement, sorry, that was not a question. The question is, has any consideration been paid to clarifying that with a subclause that relates it to some kind of transactional process? And if it has and has been discarded, why?
Can I just pick up on that? Because this is our job. I get emails every day.
Yeah, so, sorry, Your Worship, this doesn't relate to us.
I know. But the point is, I get emails asking, for instance, that parking fines be rescinded. So do staff. That's their job. They have to take those into account. So this is saying I have grave reservations about this one because it basically prevents someone from doing their job up to a point. That's what I'm saying.
My view is that, sorry, that's probably debate.
Do you have, carry on anyway.
I do have further questions, but it would appear that the recipients of the questions are otherwise engaged.
So, councillors, in respect to your comments, Councillor McTavish, the E is restricted to where lobbying has occurred. So where a lobbying conversation or engagement has occurred, that's different to when staff receive requests for assistance, requests for service, or requests for applications to be considered under delegated authority. And these are about the interests of that need to be disclosed. It means that they can be, once they're disclosed, they can be managed. So I'm thinking, trying to think, can you think of an example that...
Someone say, we could take you along to dinner.
You've completed your...
Yes, I have, thank you.
So, Councillor McTavish...
Well, yeah, just further questions in relation to that. It strikes me that without a definition of lobbying, this clause could be read fairly widely and by a lay staff member or volunteer to read that they effectively can't do their job. And so, yeah, I guess, question, is there a definition of lobbying that can be inserted, or is this clause in effect redundant?
It's not a question that we can answer directly because we're presenting the advice of the Audit and Risk Committee. When you're managing staff as a council officer, you will be able to make a judgment call on the facts and information in front of you as to whether or not what has occurred is lobbying. The point is that the conversation is on the table and it's disclosed so that you can have that, that degree of management over that issue.
Yeah, I guess what concerns me, and this is probably getting close to debate, Your Worship, but this is in the definition of conflicts of interest. And when I turn over the page to policy 6.11, all employees are expected to disclose all actual, potential or perceived conflicts of interest that they have. Well, if I interpreted 4.4e for the purposes of my role, it would be an exceptionally long list. In fact, pretty much every email that I receive from a constituent would, in my view, fall into that category. And I imagine that that would probably be the case for a large number of staff in their everyday business. So understanding that you guys haven't crafted this, and without a definition of lobbying, I guess I'm finding it difficult to clarify how this is intended to be rolled out.
All right, here's how I would like to deal with this. I'll continue to take questions, and you can, if you've got any more, then that's fine. And then questions from everyone. And if it is the will of council that there are issues here that need clarifying, I'm happy to take a motion that sends this back to the Audit and Risk Committee for further examination and maybe clarification in the text, if that's what council wishes to do. But I'll invite the rest of the questions to tease out all the concerns, and then I'll call for someone to move something.
Thank you. Happy to move that, Your Worship, if you need it.
I think you won't probably be the only one, but it's fine.
My second question relates to 6.4b, and that is the requirement to disclose any work for any organisations that have dealings with council. So if I'm a volunteer and I happen to be volunteering in, for example, the Parks Department, doing some voluntary track cutting as part of a group on council land, and in my work capacity, perhaps I work for an accounting firm that has dealings with council, am I required as part of my volunteer sign-up process to disclose who my employer is, what my role is with that employer?
So that requirement is currently there, and volunteers for council have a screening process that's very similar to an employment check.
Okay, and is that common practice?
My experience of local government is that yes, it is becoming common practice.
Okay. And in terms of extending this to volunteers, this in general to volunteers, is it the case that we generally do that with all of our policies? I mean, appreciating that it's done with things like health and safety, but is the inclusion of volunteers in this policy an exception or closer to the rule?
Unfortunately, I can't answer that question in respect of this council, but I have advised on several conflict of interest policies for other councils, and in all instances I've recommended that volunteers are included.
Okay. Thank you, Bishop.
Councillor Vandelus.
The conflict of interest register of 4.9 on page 20.7, that's administered and maintained by the Chief Executive. Is that going to be on the website, publicly available? And also, is the councillor conflict of interest website available on the website as well?
So the councillor conflicts of interest have been available on the website for this triennium, so they're all available. And the interest register of staff to a certain level will be available and will also be included on public agendas when reports are coming up.
When you say to a certain level, does that mean that the whole register won't be on the website?
That's part of the thing that we will need to work through, but for decisions that are being made publicly, most certainly the register will be, but at some level they may not be. We haven't worked through that yet.
So will we get notification of when that is worked through?
Yes.
And we may be able to retrospectively change this if required then. Thank you.
Councillor Hawkins.
Yeah, thank you, Worship. And given the way that this conversation is going, I won't elaborate further on questions. And I was planning on moving that we lay this item on the table. I wonder whether or not it would be useful to have a broader range of input between now and then than the membership of the Audit and Risk Subcommittee. With all due respect to that membership, there are obviously broader concerns that have been raised around here, and while we do have speaking rights at that meeting, we're not members and can't influence any decisions that they make. So would it not be better to have it addressed at the next meeting of council, which would allow us an opportunity collectively to contribute to the further massaging of this.
I would imagine, and my intention in allowing a motion, accepting a motion to send it back to audit and risk, was to then find a mechanism for councillors to input to the conversation within audit and risk to elucidate these concerns and find a way through, ask audit and risk to help find a way through them. So it would involve,
Happy to move that.
Yeah. So, but I do want to let everyone who wants to ask a question ask one. So, Councillor Wilson, you're next, and then Councillor Bazzi.
I only have a problem with the, just prefacing my question, with these, is how they're implemented, because policies and implementation can give a range. And so if I was looking at this and giving the example that Jinty just made, if Mountain Bike Otago, who get a $10,000 grant occasionally from us to maintain tracks on DCC property, would they be considered volunteers for the purposes of this?
Can I?
And would you expect them to be? Well, they are doing it on DCC property. So it's that implementation that, I mean, I can understand where you're going with this, but it's the implementation and your suggested in 6.1, somewhere the procedures manual, in B, the procedures manual in the register, how that's going to actually pan out, that's more important in some ways than the policy. So if Mountain Bike Otago, who get $10,000 grants from us occasionally to maintain tracks on DCC property, their volunteers rock on up. Are you expecting them all to deal with this conflict of interest? I don't understand how they don't come into that.
Because they're volunteers of the agency. They're not our volunteers.
Even they're doing it for us?
Correct.
Okay. The question I then had is, did audit and risk in coming to suggesting this look at the financials that it would have cost in implementing it? Because I would say that, especially initially, it will have a substantial compliance or cost in doing it?
So as I understand it, the costs of implementation weren't specifically before the Audit and Risk Committee, but what I can say is that the system is no different to a system that any other council operates, and costs haven't been a barrier to them implementing this. It can be as simple as an Excel spreadsheet, if that's what operationally works for this organisation.
Okay, and the last question I had is just understanding, going to my initial point, it really depends on developing the procedures manual and the register for logging officer interests, and what the time frame you expect the CEO in doing this, or is it through staff that will be doing this? Because it's one thing having a policy and understanding how it's going to pan out and how that would look. I can interpret this very, very narrowly, but the procedures manual may give you a much broader range of how you see that working and how efficient and effective it is. When do you expect to come up with that procedures manual and the time frame that you're talking to here?
Can I just suggest that one of the responses from Audit and Risk may be that the way to clarify some of these will be to develop the procedures manual concurrently. So I'm not trying to avoid the question, but I think that the uncertainty with which some of these questions are able to be answered here tells me that there needs to be clarification and some feedback to Audit and Risk to say, look, these are the issues that we see cropping up here, lack of clarity, and what comes out of that may be, as I say, the procedures manual.
Well, I suppose the question then is, if we don't do this today and do put it off, what is the risk to the organisation not to have this in place, or putting it in place knowing that the procedures manual will possibly soften that? And that's just understanding that risk, because I'm concerned with the wording, but if the procedures manual was okay, I'd be less concerned.
Look, we know that the Auditor General is keen that we get the conflicts of interest, and I'm keen that we get the conflicts of interest into a single centralised piece of work that staff find relatively easy to understand, rather than being dotted all over the show as at present. On the other hand, it is better not to sign off a policy that has things in it that make you uncomfortable, and for us to seek feedback from you pretty quickly, which we will do. We'll then go back to the Chair of Audit and Risk, discuss those things through, and then we'll come back to you as quickly as we can. We would like to get this in place as quickly as we can. As I say, there is the conflict of interest register is really the only new thing in here. The rest of it is all mentioned somewhere in the ether already, but it is not consolidated, and that does make it very hard for staff if they're trying to find out exactly how they should be conducting themselves, and that's what we're keen to sort. So,
Councillor Bezet, you had a question, and then
yeah, well, it's sort of call for a resolution. My question follows on from what's been said, really. And it involved the next steps. I mean, I thought, this may not be a question, it might be a statement, but I would have thought that I didn't think there'd be too much debate about this, because I thought that the CEO would come back with the procedures manual or a formal policy that we would look at and then make comment on it. Now, is that not the way you're going to do it? I mean, I've looked through the summary of considerations, and that is not the manual, and it's not a formal policy. So what happens if we do have further input into it? Then you come back with the formal policy or the manual, and we still have some reservations about it. So, it does need some work on it, and I mean, I'm prepared to move that it is referred back for further consideration, because it's quite messy at the moment.
Okay. All right, so we've exhausted questions. I'll take a resolution, a motion. A brief question.
I'm just wondering if you could tell us to what extent this has actually been tested by running it past the staff or a group of the staff that it affects, to see if they could, I mean, we've spotted a few, and a few I think are valid. Has there been any testing of that kind of the constraints here?
The document has been in development for quite some time, and so staff have had an opportunity to provide feedback, but not all staff. No, not all staff. This, I think, probably from the leadership forum up.
Okay. Councillor Hawkins, did you wish to move that it be referred back? So, be referred back to Audit and Risk for clarification. And Councillor McTavish, do you have?
Well, I just wondered whether, given that we have some specific areas of concern, that we highlight those.
No, can I suggest that wouldn't be helpful, in that it would restrict it, it might unduly restrict it to the concerns that have been identified today. There will be others, and I think in general it is a matter of clarification of meaning and scope. And if we leave it at that, then other things that are thought of in the discussion can come into it, rather than restricting it too much. And besides, it will take too long.
I just wonder whether, Your Worship, given that for me in particular, the extent to which it binds volunteers is a big issue. I wonder whether that could be specifically highlighted. Explaining that, in the resolution, something along the lines of, for further consideration of impact and scope, intention and scope, particularly as it relates to volunteers.
Can I ask that you refer it back to me rather than Audit and Risk? Audit and Risk isn't until April, and that means that you won't be getting it back till May, which means that it's unlikely to be in place this year, this financial year. For my staff's sake, it's really good to have this stuff consolidated into one place, so there's no further ambiguity. So if you refer it back to me, then I can arrange to have discussions with Audit and Risk that don't necessarily involve me having to go back through the committee.
That's fine. Councillor. So you're moving this, Councillor Hawkins?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Seconded, Councillor Benson Pope. You wish to speak to it? Yeah. Councillor Vanders.
This bit of work from Audit and Risk I'm actually unusually happy with, mainly because it seems to me that it's drawn on a lot of previous councils' experience, and it seems to cover all bases, and it covers them fairly thoroughly. And to me, that is what this particular document should actually do. The concerns that have been raised, and I think they are quite valid, mostly, in my view, relate to the procedures and the implementation of what this document sets out. I believe that it's very important that most of what's in this document actually does go through, because I think there are good reasons for all of it. And to pick on one, the 4.4E, the one that's been, people having been lobbied by an interested party, that comes under the heading of a situation where an employee's duties and responsibilities to council could be affected or compromised by, right? It doesn't say that they are compromised by, it says could be. And they very well could be. And you only have to look at American politics to realise how unbelievably compromised that whole country has been by lobbyists. And if you want evidence of that, look at the biggest military budget in the history of the world at a time when there's no major world conflict. So, to my mind, what this is actually a catch-all, and it needs to remain a catch-all, even to the extent of volunteers, recognising that once you've caught it all as a basic policy, you then start to moderate with procedures. You can then actually have some clarification as well, because you can't clarify all situations in a document in advance. There's always going to be situations that come up which will actually have some sort of conflict about them, but which are very hard to define in advance. So given that the Chief Executive will have essentially the final say with, as I understand it, a lot of these procedures, that the Chief Executive maintains the register, that the Chief Executive will actually decide whether the employees or even the volunteers' duties or responsibilities might have been affected or compromised by whatever. We should aim to make sure that all of those whatevers are actually in this document, because this is the starting point, and the clarification and implementation that we're looking for shouldn't be in this document. That should come later in the procedures through which this document is actually enacted. So as such, I'm entirely happy that this document actually goes through as it is. I'm also happy that we give feedback back to the Chief Executive on wording and perhaps clarifying some of the terms here. But my belief is that we need everything that is in here to effectively have a base from which to then start to decide whether anything is really a conflict or not. This is laying out what could be, not what actually is. Thank you.
Councillor Wilson.
I just want to express an agreement with Councillor Van Vest, because not that that may be shocking or unusual in itself, but that I'm concerned that what we're doing today by possibly accepting this motion is to almost flow back on Audit and Risk, who I think have done a very good job from their position, and I feel very remiss.
Chief Executive, no.
I know, I appreciate that, but I feel very remiss that we possibly, and I did read it before it went to Audit and Risk and then didn't pick up some of those issues that have been raised, that we should have been highlighting this to Audit and Risk in the process, because we are given them. And I think that if, I'm just really reluctant, and I know how important that Audit and Risk felt this was, to get this through as quickly as possible to meet, to develop those procedure manuals. So I have to express a reluctance to accept this motion. I think that we possibly should have done this work some time ago, and that we should take them in faith on that the procedures manual is the most important part here, and that we develop that in a way that deals with this, rather than crossing the T's and dotting the I's necessarily on this, because we've had that opportunity. So I'm just going to express a reluctance to support this motion for those reasons.
Further speakers? Councillor Benson.
Well, I don't think anyone, Mr Chairman, doubts the need to have this document and the vast bulk of these rules in place, and sooner rather than later. but I think the conversation equally today has demonstrated that at the moment there are clearly some areas captured that are probably not intended to be, or captured to a degree that most councillors would find unacceptable. And in terms of the clause highlighted by my colleague, Councillor Hawkins, I mean, I agree. I think that is going too far, and it's in its current form. It's denying people what are their inalienable political and civil rights, and so it needs to be addressed. You can't fix that with any procedures manual later, so let's make sure that the more egregious paragraphs in here are taken out, and we have something that's more acceptable but equally effective.
For my part, I support this resolution. I find myself agreeing with Councillor Van der Vos too. Pretty much all of this does need to stay. It's just that there may be more that needs to go in to clarify what's already there, that's all, in terms of scope and clarification. I think that where the Audit and Risk Committee has come from has been best practice. The tightest, broadest, best practice available, certainly given recent experience where we've found a lot of loopholes within council. But I do need assurance that there's some sensible scoping going to be put in here. I find it, I mean, the one I read is 4.4E, where I see all the time, where it's been lobbied by an staff have been lobbied by an interested party through comments, either formally or informally. I see emails to staff all the time doing just that, and it's part of their job to respond to them. So it's a matter of working out which of those is appropriate and which isn't. And there's not enough clarity in here for me to be comfortable to support it just the way it is. I think it's probably 98% there, but it just needs that extra assurance. So I will be supporting this resolution. And I have faith in that the Chief Executive will resolve these issues with alacrity with input from the rest of Council. Are there any further speakers? Right, a reply. Councillor Hawkins.
Yeah, thank you. We've heard in response to a number of, and I too agree that this is most of the way there and is incredibly important, but would hate to see the rush to get this signed off deny us the chance to refine a few of the rougher edges that have been pointed out by the Mayor and Councillor Bensapog and Councillor McTavish. My reluctance to specify any rough edges in particular in this motion is, as the Mayor said, to avoid the perverse outcome that we have then boxed ourselves into a corner as to what we could or couldn't address as this process reaches its final conclusion. We've heard in response to some of the concerns raised that don't worry that the policy makes this a sledgehammer, the procedures manual will whittle it down into a stick, and that we should have confidence in that process to do that work. But I would note that procedures manuals tend to be operational discussions, and the procedures manual for this policy wouldn't come back to this meeting, and so it's hard to have full confidence in our concerns being alleviated when, were this to be ratified at this meeting today, this would be the last we would see of it until perhaps some of the more perverse outcomes came into being, and then we have to go back and fix it. So I have full confidence in the process, however, for us to resolve those issues, and it's been an enlightening conversation, and so great to see faith expressed in our Chief Executive and confidence in the rights and, of our working staff here as employees also at this meeting. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to put it. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against? Carried. Thank you. Now, I'm going to move from the chair that we take a quarter-hour break. Second to Councillor Staines. We've been going for 2.5 hours. I'll put that. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against? Carried. Back here at 2:45, and don't look at that clock because it's wrong.